Hi everyone, you're on the BL Story of Love channel, the channel that shows forbidden BL stories. This story is about how an Omega on death row climbed the scaffold, revealed his pregnant belly, and the Alpha King, known for his cruelty. Don't forget to support the channel with a like and a subscription so you don't miss new forbidden BL stories. Write in the comments which city you're watching this video from. Elion had spent enough nights in the death row cell to stop counting days. In the beginning, he had scratched marks into the wall with a broken nail, a thin column of lines that tried to hold on to the idea of time. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped, not because he ran out of space, but because the effort of remembering felt more painful than letting everything blur together. The cell was a damp stone cube, carved out of the fortress like an afterthought. There was no window, only a narrow slit high under the ceiling, where a strip of dirty sky sometimes appeared as a washed-out smear of gray. In winter, a current of ice slid through it. In summer, it only carried the stink of the courtyard and the sour sweat of other prisoners. A pair of blankets, heavy and smelling of mold, lay in one corner. An iron bowl of water sat near the door, always half full, always tasting faintly of rust. The steady rhythm of boots beyond the threshold was the only reminder that a world existed outside. Everything else had retreated into memories that he pushed away on instinct. If he let them unfold too clearly, the contrast between then and now would rip him open. So he trained himself to live in fragments, in the roughness of stone under his fingertips, in the way the air cooled before dawn, in the dull ache of his lower back when he shifted on the thin mattress. The sentence written in the court records was clean, almost elegant. Complicity in conspiracy against the crown. In those neat lines of ink, it was stated that he had helped bring weapons into the palace, that he had known about the plan to kill the king, and had chosen to remain silent. On paper, his guilt was solid and convenient. Reality was messier. He had been in the wrong place with the wrong people at exactly the wrong moment. He had carried crates once for a few coins because he had needed to eat that week. He had gone out the back door of a tavern because the front was crawling with patrols. He had taken a side street, seen faces he barely knew, and then steel had glittered, shouts had erupted, and suddenly he had hands on his shoulders and a rope around his wrists. The court had not cared that he was a lower city Omega who had no family name, no patron, no power. In fact, that had made it easier. Someone had to stand as proof that the new law meant something. A young Omega with nothing but a first name was the perfect symbol. His story fit into a single sentence. No one in the audience asked for a second one. Beneath the loose prison shirt, his body carried another truth. The pregnancy could no longer be hidden. His belly curved outward, betraying the months no matter how he hunched his shoulders. Hormonal storms blurred the line between physical exhaustion and the slow suffocation of despair. Some nights his vision darkened at the edges when he stood up too quickly, and he clung to the wall until the wave passed. The child moved unevenly, as if it too felt the nearness of an ending. Sometimes it was a flutter, barely there, sometimes a sharp, insistent push that stole his breath. In the prison ledger, this detail had been reduced to one dry note about his condition, nothing more. Pregnant Omegas in the lower city were as common as cracked cobblestones and just as easily trodden on. Many disappeared without anyone bothering to write down the day. At night, when the patrol outside grew quiet and the last curses of other inmates faded into groans and snores, Elion lay on his side and drew his knees up as far as he could. One hand slipped under the thin fabric, resting on the warm swell of his abdomen. The gesture was hesitant at first, almost guilty, like a thief touching something forbidden. He did not speak out loud often, afraid the guards would hear, but sometimes a whisper escaped him anyway. "Not yet," he breathed once, when a particularly hard kick made his muscles clench. "Please, not yet." Most of the time he talked in his head. He sent the baby scraps of the life he had known before the arrest, as if stories could be stitched into a shield. He pictured the marketplace at dawn, the way stallholders shouted over one another, the smell of fish and spices and fresh bread from the bakery where he had carried sacks for a few coins. He remembered flour dusting his forearms, the heat of the ovens, the laughter of the baker's eldest daughter when he dropped a tray. He let himself recall the warmth of anonymous hands in short, clumsy encounters behind taverns. Homage bodies pressed against rough walls, breathless and brief, more about forgetting than desire. Somewhere in those months, in one of those hurried moments with an alpha who had smelled of leather and smoke, this new life had begun. He did not know who it was. The night that actually mattered refused to sharpen into a clear image. It lived in his mind as a weight of strength above him, a flash of gold at a throat, a low voice that had promised to return and never did. Sometimes he wondered if that was for the best. A faceless father was easier to curse and forgive at the same time. The day of the execution had been set long before his body fully understood that it was carrying 2 lives instead of 1. The guards spoke of it as casually as they spoke of changing shifts or bad ale. For them, it was work. Another rope to knot, another body to drag, another box to tick on a list. Soon, one of them had said once, not unkindly as he slid the bowl of water into the cell, "Make your peace, Omega. Make your peace," as if peace were something he could choose from a shelf. For Elian, the date was not a number but a line drawn in the dark. Beyond it there was nothing. He tried, in some stubborn corner of his mind, to imagine other paths. If he had been offered a choice, would he have run, knelt, begged, fought? Every attempt at that exercise ended the same way, with the same dull understanding pressing against his ribs. His voice did not travel far enough to reach the people who mattered. No one was waiting outside the walls with petitions or gold. No council member whispered his name with doubt. He was a shadow, caught in the wrong beam of torchlight. All that remained to him was the body that housed 2 heartbeats and the shrinking stretch of hours before someone decided that neither of them should exist. He could feel that decision like a weight in the air, heavy and impersonal, descending inch by inch every time keys rattled at his door. In those moments, his hand would tighten over his belly, nails biting into his own skin, and an ugly, fierce thought would flash through him. "I will not let them forget you," he thought towards the small life that shifted under his palm. "Even if they erase me, I will not let them pretend you were never here." The cell did not answer. It only breathed its damp breath over him, the stone walls holding the silence like water in a well. Outside, beyond the slit of sky and arches of the fortress, the machinery of law and fear kept turning, blind to the fact that in one of its smallest cogs, time was already almost gone. There had been a time when people spoke Kellen's name with something like pride. In the early years of his reign, tavern songs praised a young alpha king who walked among market stalls, who listened to petitions in the open courtyard rather than from behind carved doors. He had lowered some taxes, reopened an old aqueduct, ordered that the worst prison pits be filled and rebuilt as proper cells. His scribes had called it a new era. He had believed them. Back then, he had seen mercy as a craft, not a weakness. Justice, he thought, was a balance. The law in one hand, the weight of each life in the other. He had overturned a handful of sentences that smelled too much of noble grudges. He had commuted the punishment of a thief who had stolen bread for his younger siblings, sending him instead to work on the king's own stables. The first time he did that, an old counselor had murmured that too much leniency would soften the spine of the throne. "The throne does not break because I spare one boy," Kellen had answered, almost amused. "It breaks when people stop believing it can listen." He had meant it. Then, the night that later chroniclers named the Night of Ash burned that conviction out of him. It began with something as simple as trust. An Omega from the palace household, someone whose face the guards knew and whose scent no one questioned, carried a tray into the private wing. Wine, bread, a small covered dish of seasoned meat. It was the kind of late meal that arrived at odd hours when council meetings ran long. No one searched it. No one searched him. The threat did not reach Kellen's own veins. The tasters did their duty, and the cup fell from numb fingers before he ever touched it. But poison did not care whose mouth it entered first. By dawn, 2 people who had shared his table and his bed in different years were lying still, breath rattling once, then fading. One was a cousin who had been his closest link to a childhood before the crown. The other was a captain of the guard who had taught him to wield a sword when it was still too heavy for his hands. They never woke. Their skin grayed, their lips tightened, and the healers could do nothing but bow their heads. The Omega who had carried the tray was dragged to the dungeons, screaming that he had not known, that someone had switched the bottles, that he had only followed orders. Kellen had not gone down to see him. He had stood in the ruined dining room, shards of glass under his boots, and stared at the dark stains on the tablecloth until his vision blurred. By morning, a proclamation was ready. Mercy, he declared, had opened the gate for this betrayal. From that day forward, there would be no more softening of sentences in cases that touched the safety of the crown. Omegas, once spoken of in his court as fragile and in need of protection, were quietly reclassified in the minds of his advisors as possible liabilities. They could be turned, they could be used, they could slip poison past guards who had grown too used to their presence. The decree of immediate execution for anyone tied to plots against the throne became one of the first orders he signed with a hand that no longer trembled. Trials were still held, at least in name, but their outcomes in such matters were rarely in doubt. Counselors who suggested that each case should be weighed separately found themselves speaking less and less. It was not that Kellen shouted them down, he simply stopped asking. In his head, the world split cleanly in two. There were those who kept him on the throne and those who threatened it. The second kind had to be removed swiftly before they multiplied. Once, he had believed that fear alone could not hold a kingdom. Now, he was no longer sure. Fear, at least, did not fall asleep beside you and fail to wake. By the time Elion's name reached the courts, the king no longer read full case files. He received summaries on neat sheets of parchment carried in by secretaries who bowed low and kept their eyes on the floor. Each report was a column of short descriptions and outcomes: a merchant accused of feeding silver to rebels, a captain suspected of selling maps, a lower city Omega allegedly involved in moving weapons near the palace perimeter. That last line did not stand out. There were no noble titles attached to it, no intricate web of alliances. Just a note about origin, one sentence about the alleged crime, and the closing words that had become almost automatic in such circumstances: execution by hanging at the appointed time. Kellen initialed the margin with a practiced flick of the wrist. The ink dried. The sheet joined the others. Beyond the signatures, something else was eroding quietly inside him. Fear of losing control, mixed with a bone-deep exhaustion from being always braced for the next threat. He left the fortress less often, delegating public appearances to heralds and minor princes. The open court sessions of his early reign were replaced by private audiences with selected petitioners screened in advance. He surrounded himself with mechanisms, laws, decrees, loyal officers that could act without his constant presence. It was easier that way, to trust the structure instead of his own wavering instincts. When one or two younger advisors murmured that a kingdom held only by terror would one day break, a tight, irritated heat rose in his chest. "Fear keeps them from reaching for knives," he said once too sharply. Afterward, he realized his hands had curled into fists on the armrests of the throne. There were memories he pushed away with equal determination. Nights when he had slipped out of the palace in plain clothes, hood drawn low, with only one or two guards trailing at a distance. In those brief hours, he had allowed himself to be only a man, sitting in the dim corners of taverns where smoke clung to the ceiling and cheap ale tasted of metal. Anonymous bodies moved closer, seeking warmth and coin. Omegas leaned in with practiced smiles and wary eyes. Those encounters had been a different kind of escape. In narrow rooms above kitchens, on pallets that smelled of sweat and soap, he had found a way to quiet the roar of responsibilities for a handful of heartbeats. He did not share his name. He never asked for theirs. That, he told himself, made it cleaner. One of those nights had ended abruptly when a messenger, breathless, found him even there and hissed that the council required his presence immediately. He had left in such a hurry that he did not even look properly at the face of the Omega, whose body had just begun to relax under his hands. There had been a glimpse of dark eyes in the half-light, a flush on soft skin, the sharp tang of fear, and something like reluctant trust in the scent. He had pressed a coin into the other's palm, murmured, "This never happened," and gone back to the palace, back into armor and titles and sealed doors. In the years that followed, he filed those memories alongside other things he could no longer afford. being touched without calculation, being seen as anything but a ruler. Human weakness, he told himself, belonged to the past. He chose to remember the night of ash instead, the cold bodies on linen, the poison-blackened lips, as proof that softness led nowhere but to loss. So when the scribes wrote of his reign after that, they did not mention the early days of open courts and overturned sentences. They wrote of a king who no longer believed in mercy, who trusted paper more than faces, who signed his name beneath death orders as if they were simply another piece of administration. They did not write about the part of him that still woke some nights with the phantom taste of tavern smoke in his mouth, or with the ghost of an Omega's scent curling at the edge of his awareness, and wondered, for a single unguarded breath, what might have happened if he had held on to kindness instead of letting it burn. The morning chosen for the hanging began like so many others in the capital, with mist clinging low over the cobblestones and the air carrying the sour smell of last night's fires. For most people, the day started with the same chores as always, but the closer it came to the fortress square, the more the rhythm of the city twisted around a different heartbeat. Feet that might have walked to market turned instead towards the high walls. Voices that usually bartered for fish and cloth lowered into a different kind of murmur. By the time the sun had climbed one hesitant hand above the horizon, people were already gathering on the open space in front of the fortress. They clustered in uneven rings around the wooden scaffold, leaving a bare circle of trampled earth beneath it. For some, it was a spectacle, a harsh entertainment that broke the monotony of hunger and work. For others, it was a grim reminder that in this kingdom, law had the shape of a rope and the weight of a falling body. The scaffold itself creaked softly as the executioners moved about it, checking beams and knots with practiced hands. The wood was darkened by age and weather and other mornings just like this one. Knots slid beneath calloused fingers, tightened, loosened, tightened again. One of the men jumped once on the trapdoor to make sure the hinges still obeyed, and the heavy thud rolled out across the silent square like a promise. Around them, the royal guard took their positions. Shields flashed briefly as the pale light caught polished metal. Lines were drawn, invisible but understood. Here, the soldiers, there, the crowd. Voices in the square dropped to whispers as people leaned closer to one another, trading rumors and breathy fragments. Some swore they knew who would swing that day. Others admitted they had come precisely to find out. In the bowels of the fortress, far from the chill air of the square, Elion was woken before dawn by the rattle of keys at his door. He surfaced from a shallow, jagged sleep, heart already pounding as if it had been running ahead of him while he dreamt. The darkness of the cell felt heavier than usual, full of something waiting. "Up," a rough voice said through the wood. "It is time." The words did not surprise him. They had always been there at the edge of his thoughts, like a line of ink not yet read aloud. Still, for a heartbeat, his body refused to move. His hand went automatically to his belly, feeling for that small, solid curve, as if he needed proof that the life inside him had not slipped away in the night. Chains bit cold around his ankles, metal kissing skin that had already been rubbed raw by weeks of restraints. His wrists were bound with coarse rope that scratched at the thin skin over his bones. The shirt they gave him was a rough prison tunic, clean enough but brutally plain, hanging off his shoulders and failing to hide how his body had changed. The curve of his stomach pushed against the fabric, undeniable. One of the guards glanced down as he tightened the knots. His gaze snagged on the rounded shape under the cloth. For a second, his hands stilled, fingers pressing into the rope as if they were not sure whether to keep going. "He is," the man started, then cut himself off. His mouth compressed into a line. Orders were clear. Orders did not mention exceptions. Another guard, older, gave him a flat look. "Move," he said. "Do not think." For a moment, Elion thought he heard something like apology in the first man's silence. Then the moment passed. The rope held. The door opened. The walk from the death row corridor to the surface was short in distance and endless in sensation. Stone swallowed sound, then threw it back in distorted echoes, the clank of chains, the scrape of boots, the uneven cadence of Elion's breath. The narrow stairs forced him to move carefully, each step a small negotiation between balance and the weight he carried in front of him. Servants they passed in side corridors pressed themselves against the walls, eyes lowered, hands full of bread baskets or folded linens. Some looked up quickly, only to flinch away when they saw the irons, the tunic, the swollen belly. No one spoke. The silence felt less like respect and more like self-preservation, as if any sound might draw the attention of the law to them instead. Elion kept his gaze fixed on the floor, on the cracked edges of stone slabs, on the shadows of bars that the torches flung across the path. Focusing on those small, immediate details was easier than thinking about the square, the scaffold, the rope. Inside him, the child had woken, as if sensing that something in the air had changed. Little feet pressed against his palm when he dared to rest it briefly against his stomach, a restless, frantic rhythm. Easy, he breathed, barely moving his lips. Please. Easy. The smell of the fortress changed as they climbed. Damp stone and stale straw gave way to a colder, sharper blend of outside air and the faint tang of smoke from morning fires. Somewhere above, a gull cried, the sound thin and distant. Light bled ahead of them, not the thin gray strip from his cell, but a wider, harsher brightness. When they stepped out onto the yard that led to the main gate, the sky felt enormous after so many days under a ceiling. Clouds drifted low and slow, heavy with the threat of later rain. For one strange heartbeat, Elion thought it looked almost peaceful. Then his eyes found the scaffold rising over the square beyond the gate, and the illusion shattered. The noise of the crowd hit him as a wave. It was not a single sound, but hundreds layered on top of one another. Whispers, coughs, the squeal of a child who did not yet understand why they were there, the low mutter of men who had seen this too many times. As he was led through the narrow passage and out onto the open square, conversations faltered. Heads turned. The movement rippled outward from the path he walked like rings on disturbed water. He felt their eyes like fingers on his skin. Some slid away quickly, as if contact might burn. Others stayed, curious, hungry, searching his face for some sign of monster or martyr to feed their stories later. A few faces were shuttered completely, expressions clenched, shoulders tight, as if they had come not to watch, but because not coming might be noticed. The boards of the scaffold groaned underfoot as he was guided up the steps. The sound made his stomach twist. He could not help imagining how many bodies those boards had held before his, how many last breaths had been dragged into the open air above this very trap door. The wind up here was sharper, slipping under the edge of his tunic and over the damp skin at the back of his neck. The bulge of his belly was impossible to hide at that height. As he stepped into full view, the murmur from the crowd changed in tone. Surprise, even shock, sliced through the low buzz like a knife. "He is pregnant," someone hissed, the words carrying farther than they were meant to. The reaction spread quickly. A few people turned away, faces tightening with discomfort. Others leaned forward, eyes wide, as if the sight of a condemned Omega with an obvious child inside was some rare, morbid curiosity. In all their lives they had seen hangings, floggings, men and women branded or dragged away. This, though, was different. This forced them to see not only the punished body, but the second life riding within it. The executioner moved with the weary efficiency of a man who had done this too many times to be rattled by whispers. He checked the beam overhead, pulled at the rope, looked down at Elion with a gaze that held neither cruelty nor pity, only a practiced distance. With a firm hand at the shoulder, he pushed him into position at the center of the platform, directly over the trap. "Stand still," he said, voice low enough that only Elion heard. "Do not make it worse." Far above the square, on a balcony that jutted from the black stone of the fortress, a figure in a dark cloak watched. The king seldom came down among the people on days like this. His place was up there, framed by carved stone, a distant silhouette against the pale strip of sky. His presence, even as a shadow, was a reminder that this was not just punishment, but spectacle sanctioned from the very top. The message was clear. The law reached everywhere. Elion did not look up. He knew someone stood there. Everyone knew. But to him that figure was only an outline, an abstraction in heavy cloth, another part of the machine that had taken his name and turned it into a line of ink under the word guilty. The noose hung at his side, rough hemp coiled like a sleeping snake. With each passing second, it seemed to creep closer, though it had not moved at all. His awareness narrowed until almost everything else faded. There were still guards, still a crowd, still a king on a balcony, but all of that receded behind the scrape of the rope against wood and the rasp of his own breathing. Inside him, the child kicked again, hard this time, as if hammering against the inside of his ribs. Pain flashed sharp and hot across his abdomen. The suddenness of it almost buckled his knees. Not here, he thought wildly. Not like this. The guards waited, eyes flicking once toward the balcony. There was no need to read the sentence aloud. Everyone present already knew its content. In this kingdom, the formality of words had been replaced by the harsher simplicity of gestures. A lifted hand, a nod, a dropped cloth. The machine did not need poetry to function. From where Elian stood, the world seemed to hold its breath. The cold air pressed against his teeth. The fibers of the rope brushed his neck as the executioner lifted it, the coarse strands catching on the fine hairs there. Time did not slow in any magical way. It simply thickened, each heartbeat a heavy, separate thing. For the officers on the edge of the scaffold, for the courtiers peering from the safety of their high windows, this was another proceeding in a long line of them. The wheel of law turned, and another nameless body was about to be fed into its teeth. For the small life twisting in Elian's womb, and for the man whose body carried that life towards the drop, this day was not a line in a ledger. It was the only reality they had. One final morning, one scaffold, one rope, and a kingdom that had already decided there was no room for them on the ground. The moment that changed everything arrived so quickly that even Elian did not understand what had gone wrong at first. The executioner had one hand on his shoulder, steering him with the absent familiarity of a man who had guided many bodies to the same place. Another step, he thought, just one more step to stand exactly over the trapdoor. The boards shifted underfoot. Whether it was a knot in the wood or the way the chain pulled at his ankles, Elian's weight tipped slightly off balance. His foot slipped, his body lurched forward, and he caught himself with an awkward twist. The rough fabric of the tunic snagged on the rope at his wrists and rode upward. The movement was small, but in that suspended moment it felt immense. The hem of the tunic climbed, the cloth stretched tight over his abdomen, then hitched up high enough that the curve of his belly was exposed to the cold air. Not a hint, not a soft suspicion hidden in folds of cloth, but the full round shape of late pregnancy, taut and undeniable. A sound rolled through the crowd like wind hitting a field of dry grass. A collective intake of breath, followed by scattered exclamations. The murmuring that had hummed through the square since dawn broke into jagged pieces. "He is carrying," someone in the front hissed. "Saints," another voice said, not quite a prayer. "They will hang him with a child inside." Even those who had tried to watch with hardened faces looked away for a heartbeat, as if the sight of the bare, swollen skin offended some line they had not known they still had. Others stared more intently, eyes narrowing, struggling to fit this reality into their understanding of the king's law. The decree had not mentioned what to do with an unborn life tied to a condemned throat. On the scaffold, the executioner swore under his breath and reached to yank the tunic back down, but his hand hesitated halfway. For the first time that morning, uncertainty flickered across his features. The routine was broken. The body in front of him was no longer just a weight to be dropped. It was a vessel with two heartbeats. Far above, on the balcony that cut a dark line against the fortress wall, Kellen's gaze, which had been distant and unfocused, snapped into sharp clarity. Until that instant, he had seen only the broad picture, the scaffold, the crowd, the thin shape of another condemned man in a plain tunic. A small figure in a ritual he himself had set in motion years ago. Now the figure shifted, the cloth rode up, and a pale, rounded belly caught the light. It was not an illusion of distance. Even from where he stood, Kellen could see the way the skin stretched, the faint line running from navel to ribs, the way the prisoner's hand jerked instinctively as if to cover the exposed curve. The knowledge landed in him with a physical jolt. Omega, he thought, not with the detached knowledge of court reports, but with the full sensory memory of scent and heat and breath. Omega, heavily pregnant, brought to the rope. For a heartbeat, another night crashed over the sight before him, a cramped room above a tavern, walls stained by smoke, the world reduced to the heat of two bodies and the vivid tangle of fear and need in the air. The scent had been sharp then, too, edged with anxiety and faint hope, threaded through with something sweet that had nothing to do with perfume. He had buried his face in a throat that trembled under his mouth and breathed in salt and skin and the smallest trace of flower dust. He had promised nothing that night, and yet some part of him, the part that had not yet been armored by the night of ash, had wanted to. Then duty had ripped him away, and he had shoved the memory down so deep that he almost believed it was no longer his. Now the smell did not reach him through the cold air of the square, but his body remembered it anyway, filling in the distance on its own. His fingers tightened on the stone railing until his knuckles whitened. For the first time in many years, the scene below him refused to stay abstract. "This is a child," something in him said, quiet and furious. "This is not just a sentence carried out on a traitor. There is a child in that body." His counselors had argued theory with him for seasons. They had spoken of deterrence, of law, of order. They had spoken of omitting exceptions because exceptions were where weakness crept in. None of them had stood with their stomachs tight while a rope brushed the neck of someone who might be carrying their blood. "Enough," Kellen heard himself say, though the word did not yet carry beyond his own teeth. The executioner reached for the noose. The crowd's murmur swelled again. A gull cried somewhere above, its raw note slicing the heavy air. Time seemed to draw in on itself, each movement magnified. Kellen lifted his hand. It was not the gesture they were used to seeing before a hanging. The usual signal was small and decisive, a downward flick like the closing of a book. Now his arm came up instead, palm outwards in a commanding halt. The guards on the scaffold saw it first. Years of training froze them in place before their minds had caught up. "Hold!" one of the captains shouted, voice cracking with surprise. "By the king's command, hold!" The executioner stumbled back one step, the rope still looped in his hands. He looked from the Omega at his feet to the balcony above, as if hoping he had misread the signal. The square, which a moment earlier had been buzzing with low, restless sound, fell into an uneasy silence. Even those at the very edge who could not see the king clearly felt the shift. The machine that had seemed to run on its own gears had suddenly jerked to a stop. Kellen did not sit back. He leaned over the stone slightly, his cloak pulling at his shoulders, and let his voice carry down, hard and clipped, honed by years of command. "Stay the execution," he said. "Place the prisoner under special guard. The case is to be re-examined in full." The words were brief, but they struck the square harder than any shouted sentence. The exact phrasing blurred as they bounced off stone and flesh, but the meaning did not. The order for immediate hanging was gone. In its place was something no one there had heard in many years. A pause. And Omega, already standing under the noose, was not going to die that day. Shock rippled outward, invisible but palpable. In the crowd, some faces lit with a cautious, almost fearful hope. Others darkened, brows drawing together, mouths twisting as they swapped hurried whispers about royal weakness. An old woman in the second row crossed herself with shaking fingers. A young man beside her spat on the ground, muttering that the king had finally let his heart soften and that nothing good would come of it. The soldiers guarding the edges of the square tightened their formations instinctively, as if expecting the air itself to rebel. Many of them had served under the decree of immediate execution for as long as they had worn armor. In all those years, they had never seen it set aside once the rope was already on the scaffold. Even the seasoned captains traded quick, uncertain glances. On the balcony behind Kellen, advisors shifted, uneasy. One stepped forward half a pace, then thought better of it. Whatever had prompted this intervention, it had not been discussed in any council chamber. Alion did not grasp the full shape of what was happening. Fear had blurred his sense of the square into a smear of color and noise. He was aware first of the rope against his neck not tightening, then slipping away. Fingers that had been impersonal and firm now moved with a strange, almost awkward care, lifting the hemp boundary between him and the drop. His knees weakened as the weight of the noose left his skin. For a heartbeat he thought he was falling anyway. Strong hands caught his arms, holding him upright. The guards who gripped him no longer shoved, they steadied, their touch cautious, as if the life inside him made him fragile in some new, official way. "What?" The word scraped out of his raw throat before he could stop it. "Quiet," a guard murmured, but the edge had gone from his tone. The king has spoken. They turned him around, away from the yawning rectangle of the trap door, away from the sea of faces below the scaffold. The sudden absence of the rope at his back felt unreal, as if he had stepped sideways out of his own death and into a corridor he had not seen before. He braced himself for the familiar descent into the dungeon's stairwell, back to the cold stone belly of the fortress. Instead, the path they took led in another direction, down from the scaffold, across a cleared strip of ground, through a smaller gate that opened not to the outer yards, but towards the inner court. Each step traced a line that had not been drawn for any prisoner in many years. Elion felt it without being able to name it. The crowd's noise crashed against his back, like waves against a hull, full of speculation, outrage, confused joy, barely contained fear. He kept one hand pressed against his belly as they guided him forward, as if to reassure himself that the child inside was still there, that the kicks he had felt earlier had not been some cruel trick. The fortress walls rose ahead of him, dark and high. Behind those stones, men who had almost killed him now argued in low, urgent voices about what to do with him instead. The scaffold, the rope, the wide, watching sky fell away behind. Whatever script had been written for his last morning had been torn in half in front of the entire kingdom. In its place, a new, unfinished line waited, stretching beyond the inner gate into a future that no one on that square had yet dared to imagine. The corridors they led him through now were not the same ones that had swallowed him on the way to death row. The air was different here. The damp chill of the lower levels gave way to a cooler, cleaner draft that smelled faintly of wax and iron rather than rot. The walls were still stone, but smoother, their surfaces scrubbed and patched instead of left to flake. Torches burned more steadily, flames held in proper brackets instead of smoking in rusted rings. The men who walked these passages did not wear the dull, patched leather of ordinary jailers. Their armor was darker, better fitted, the crest of the inner guard hammered into the metal of their breastplates. They carried themselves with the wary discipline of people who understood that anything reaching this part of the fortress mattered. "Special guard," one of them had muttered outside the scaffold, as if trying the words on his tongue. In these corridors the phrase took on weight. Elion kept his head down, more from habit than instruction. Even so, he could not help noticing small, alien details, the sound of quills scratching on parchment from an open doorway, a glimpse of a tapestry, threads dull in the low light but still richer than anything he had ever touched, the way servants who passed them wore actual shoes rather than rags wrapped around their feet. They climbed, the incline slight but relentless, until his legs trembled. The weight of the child dragged at the muscles in his back, a slow, steady pull. When they finally stopped, it was in front of a thick wooden door, banded with iron. One guard produced a key from a ring at his belt and turned it in the lock with a solid, final click. The room beyond felt almost like a lie. It was small, yes, but not a pit. Light entered through a narrow window set high in the wall, so close to the roof beams that he had to tilt his head back to see the slice of sky through it. Dust danced lazily in that pale shaft, proof that the air moved here. Beneath the window stood a narrow bed with a thin but intact mattress, more than a heap of straw and stone. There was a rough table with 4 legs that did not wobble, a stool, and a ceramic jug of water that did not taste of metal when he later sipped from it. Compared to the dripping hole he had come from, it was almost luxury. And yet every detail whispered the same truth. The door closed with a heavy sound, the key turned, footsteps retreated. This was not freedom. It was a different shape of cage. "Sit," one of the guards said, not unkindly. "The healers are coming." He sank onto the edge of the bed, breathless with a fatigue that felt buried deep in bone. The mattress dipped under his weight, unfamiliar but not unpleasant. For a few heartbeats he only stared at his hands, still marked by rope burns as they lay on his knees. His mind had not yet caught up with his body. He was not dangling from a rope. His neck was free. His lungs still moved. "I am not dead," the thought came, stark and almost obscene. Not yet. The door opened again before he could decide what to do with that fact. A pair of healers entered, their plain robes marked with the discreet silver pin of the Royal Infirmary. Behind them came an assistant carrying a small chest of instruments. Their presence brought with it a different sort of silence, the focused hush of professionals who knew the taste of crisis. They did not speak to him at first. They spoke to each other, to the guards, to the space, naming numbers and measures without using them. Pulse, pressure, term. Risk! Lie back, one of them said at last, his tone firm but not sharp. Elion obeyed, easing himself onto the mattress, the effort making him grunt softly. Cold hands lifted his shirt, baring his stomach to the now familiar chill of the room. Fingers pressed into his skin, mapped the curve, found the child's position. A cone of polished wood was placed against his belly, and the healer bent his head, listening. The pause stretched. Elion stared at the ceiling, counting breaths until the man straightened. Strong, the healer murmured to his colleague. The child is strong. For a second, heat pricked behind Elion's eyes. Strong. The word lodged in his throat like a stone. They checked him thoroughly, moving with brisk efficiency. A cuff tightened around his arm to measure the beat of his blood. Questions were asked about dizziness, pain, bleeding. They did not glance away when he answered, when his voice shook. There was none of the careless dismissal he had met before as a prisoner. Now each piece of information seemed to matter. He understood why when he caught a phrase spoken low between them. "The king's order," one said. "His condition is to be monitored. Personally." That word landed differently than special guard. Personally. Somewhere beyond these walls, the same hand that had just raised itself to stop a hanging had also pointed towards this room and said, "Watch him." It changed nothing and everything. He was still a condemned man whose fate rested in other people's mouths. But now his body, and the life it carried, had become objects of interest to the most dangerous person in the kingdom. It made their gloved touch gentler, their eyes sharper, their notes more careful. It did not make him safer. It only tied him more tightly to a power he neither trusted nor understood. Above his head, in rooms he would never see, the fortress shifted into a different gear. The unprecedented halt on the scaffold tore through the corridors like a gust through rooms filled with old dust. Counselors were summoned, some dragged from their beds, others caught mid-meal. The private council chamber, with its high windows and long table, filled with strained faces and rustling robes, questions flew fast and controlled. Why this Omega? Why now? What distinguished him from the others who had stood where he stood that morning? Was this a one-time impulse or the beginning of a change in policy? What would it signal to enemies, to allies, to the restless districts beyond the river? Kellen listened to their arguments, but his mind drifted back to the square, to the way the tunic had ridden up, to the exposed curve of skin and the way his own chest had tightened. Logic lined up neatly in the mouths of his advisors. We must not appear inconsistent. Mercy invites manipulation. If you spare one today, the next 10 will expect the same. Their voices were a steady rain against stone. None of them had felt what he had felt in that heartbeat when rope and life had hung side by side. He said little. His orders were few and sharp. The case file was to be brought in full. Every witness questioned again, every guard report reviewed, every missing piece in the chain of proof hunted down. He wanted to know, down to the smallest detail, whether the man whose neck had nearly broken under his decree truly belonged on that scaffold at all. Under that scrutiny, the once smooth narrative began to fray. Things that had been waved away during the first trial now glowed like embers in the ashes. A guard's testimony did not match his own earlier written statement. A piece of evidence, listed in an inventory, could not be produced. A name appeared on the perimeter report that also appeared on a list of known agitators in a rival faction's file. The case that had seemed so convenient began to look suspiciously tidy, as if someone had needed a body to fit a law and had reached for the nearest disposable shape. None of this reached Elion. His world had shrunk again, this time to the rectangle of his new room. He learned its contours by touch and repetition, the bed that creaked in a particular way when he rolled to his other side, the pattern of sunlight and shadow as the day moved past the high window, the sound of boots coming and going outside his door, different now, heavier, more frequent. Guards brought him food at regular intervals. Bread less stale than he was used to, broth that actually contained pieces of meat and vegetables rather than just the ghost of them. Each time the door opened, he tensed, breath catching, half expecting the word mistake. half expecting the cold hand of the law to close around his throat again and drag him back to the square. Instead, he received metal trays and short, impersonal phrases. Eat. Rest. The healers will return. They did, once in the morning and once in the evening, checking his pulse, his temperature, the child's heartbeat. They told him very little, but the fact that they kept coming at all was more information than any words. Inside him, where for weeks there had been only a scraped-out hollow and the slow mechanical count towards nothing, something new began to take root. It did not grow easily. It was edged with fear, pricked by disbelief, wrapped in the same instinct that made him curl around his belly when he slept. Hope, when it came, did not arrive as a clear picture of freedom or a future. It slid in as a shadow of a thought that refused to be crushed no matter how hard he pressed down on it. Maybe the child would be born, not a certainty, not even a plan, just a possibility, that these walls might one day hear the first cry of the little life that had kicked and twisted through every moment of his despair, that his son or daughter might see light that was more than a washed-out strip between stones, that the first sky those eyes saw would not be framed by a noose. The idea was dangerous. He knew it. It made his heart stutter and his hands shake. In a place where everything could be taken away with a signature, allowing himself even that small internal flicker felt like stepping onto thin ice. He lay awake long into the artificial night, watching the pale square of the window fade to black, one hand resting on the steady curve of his abdomen. The fortress around him hummed with quiet, contained activity as others debated his fate. He could not hear their words. He could only feel the faint roll of the child under his palm and the treacherous, fragile warmth that rose in his chest each time it moved. "Do not do this," he whispered to himself once, not sure whether he spoke to his own heart or to the tiny one beating beneath it. "Do not hope." But the fact remained, stubborn and alive. The rope had not closed around his neck, and special guard had closed around his door instead. The second investigation did not begin with fanfare. It began with a quiet order from the king and the soft, relentless scrape of parchment being pulled from shelves. Clerks in the archive rooms shifted stacks of files that had not been touched since the ink dried on them. Dust rose, caught the light, settled again on tables where case reports were laid out in careful rows. The file bearing Eleon's name looked deceptively simple at first glance. There was the original arrest record, the brief summary of charges, the transcript of a hearing conducted at speed, the signed sentence. Everything seemed in place, each page in its proper order, every signature where it should be. Then someone turned to the back and noticed that a witness report had been written by one guard and signed by another. A small thing, easy to overlook when everyone assumed guilt, but the king's command had been explicit. No assumptions, every line examined. They sent for the guard whose name was on the signature. The runner returned with an empty gaze and a shrug. The man had left his post on the eve of the trial and never returned. No one could say exactly when he had gone. His pay had been collected that last week by a cousin. The cousin, when questioned, suddenly could not be found. The neat pattern of the narrative shifted. Timestamps on patrol logs were checked next. A scribe traced the inked hours with the tip of his finger, frowning when one list placed Eleon's arrest at the armory yard, while another, written by a different hand, put him in custody already when that sweep took place. The location of the arrest oscillated between the weapons storehouse and a side street 2 alleys away, as if reality itself could not quite decide where it had happened. On maps pinned to the walls of a smaller chamber, the investigators marked each place mentioned in the reports. Lines and arrows started to contradict one another. Step by step, they reconstructed the night as it had officially been recorded, and the more they did, the more it resembled a story someone had told in haste and never expected anyone to question. His connection to the conspirators, when pulled apart, looked thin. Yes, he had crossed paths with some of them. In the tavern where he worked, men whispered over cups about politics and prices and revenge. In the narrow lanes, he used to slip home unseen. Familiar faces appeared and vanished with the shifting tides of the lower city. But there were no witnesses who had seen him carry a weapon, no letter in his handwriting, no coin traced from the rebels' coffers to his hands. Everything rested on a single assumption, that an Omega seen in the wrong place at the wrong time must have been there with intent. In a kingdom braced against treason, the word probably had been enough to tighten a noose. The council reconvened to look at the new findings. The same chamber, the same chairs, but a different tension in the air. For some, the idea of revisiting a closed case tasted of ash. To admit error was to admit that the system they had defended so fiercely could break in ways that cost lives. Their arguments came sharp and defensive. If we pull at one thread, one said, we risk unraveling the entire cloth. Others saw in this moment a narrow, dangerous opportunity. If even the king's harshest laws could fail to prevent injustice, perhaps that truth needed to be faced before it devoured more than nameless omegas. They spoke more slowly, choosing words that would not sound like accusation. In the end, there was no unanimous conclusion. There was, however, a shared recognition that the certainty of Elion's guilt had cracked. It was no longer a solid block of stone. It had fault lines. Elion himself felt the shift first, not in decrees, but in the way people looked at him across a table. When they brought him to the questioning room the first time, he braced for the familiar pattern. He remembered the original hearing all too well, the hard faces, the quick questions that allowed only yes or no, the way every answer seemed to already have a place waiting for it, no matter what he said. This room was similar, stone and wood and a single narrow window high on the wall. But the men and women seated opposite him did not start by reciting charges. They had quills ready, parchment blank. "Tell us about that night," one of them said, "from the beginning." His first instinct was silence. The words felt dangerous in his mouth, like shards he might cut himself on. For a heartbeat, all he could see behind his closed eyes was the scaffold, the rope, the crowd. "I was just trying to leave work," he heard himself say, voice hoarse. There was a fight. They let him speak in full sentences, not clipped fragments. He told them about the tavern that had grown louder as the evening wore on, about a patron who had thrown a cup, about a shout that turned into a brawl. The owner had yelled at him to get out of the way, to take the empties through the back before they ended up breaking more crockery. He described the alley behind the tavern, how it twisted and narrowed, how he had chosen that route so many nights without incident, how that evening the lane had been crowded with bodies that did not belong there, with cloaks and whispered names he had heard only in passing before. He had kept his head down, hugging the wall, thinking only of getting through and past them, away. He remembered the glint of blades only as a flash at the edge of his vision. Officers shouted. Someone ran. A hand caught his wrist, shoved him to the ground. A knee pressed into his spine. A voice demanded his name. He had given it, stunned and breathless. "I told them I was just passing through," he said now, hands clenching in his lap. "They did not care. I was close enough to count." The questions that came were different this time. Instead of hammering at the same accusation, they circled the details. What had the conspirators been saying to one another? Which direction had they come from? Had he noticed any insignia, heard any specific phrases? They asked about times, about distances, about who else might have seen what he saw. Fragments he had shoved into the back of his mind to avoid thinking about them now surfaced. A mention of a shipment delayed at the river. A half-heard joke about the king choking on his own laws. A particular way one man had touched his sleeve in the tavern when he had passed, as if weighting him with a casual familiarity that did not belong there. Each small memory, previously ignored or useless when no one cared, became a brick in a different wall. Not a wall of his guilt, but a structure that showed the outlines of those who had used him as cover. Between sessions he was taken back to his small room. The pattern repeated over days that blurred but did not disappear. Every time they called for him, fear coiled in his gut. Every time he left the table alive, that coiling loosened just a fraction. He began to understand, slowly and with a kind of cold amazement, how narrow the gap had been between his life and his death. One wrong corner, one wrong moment of eye contact, one officer too eager to bring in a suspect. That had been enough to stamp a death sentence on his file. It hit him with a different weight now that people were actually listening. "My life was convenient," he thought once, sitting alone with his hands wrapped around a mug of cooling broth. Not important, not valuable. Convenient. The realization hurt in a way the ropes and chains had not. They had always been honest in their brutality. The quiet bureaucracy of his condemnation was the part that made his skin crawl. Yet threaded through that horror was another, more disorienting strand. None of this new attention, none of these careful questions would have existed if one man on a balcony had not raised his hand. The truth surfacing now was not an accident. It was being pulled up on purpose, like a net from dark water. He did not know why the king had chosen him. He did not know that the echo of an old night in a tavern clung to his scent in the king's memory. He knew only that the same authority that had almost erased him had, with a single gesture, dragged him back into the light. It was a bewildering, dangerous gift. Gratitude and resentment twisted together in him until he could not tell them apart. He did not trust the hand that held his fate, but he could not deny that it was holding it differently now. How strange, he thought, lying awake with one arm draped over his sleeping belly, that the crack in his supposed guilt had not come from his own protest, from any appeal he could have made. It had come from someone else, finally deciding to look closer at the lines they had already drawn. Outside his small, guarded world, ink continued to spread across pages, tying names to deeds and erasing old certainties. Inside, under his skin, a child shifted, unbothered by politics, as if impatient to enter a world where questions, for once, were beginning to matter. The meeting between them in the narrow room under the fortress roof did not happen quickly. Days passed in which only reports traveled between floors. They arrived in stacks on Kellen's desk, edges smudged by ink and fingers, each sheet another reminder that the case of the pregnant condemned man refused to settle back into the comfortable shape of guilt. He read witness accounts that contradicted one another, lists of missing evidence, notes from healers about the strength of the child's heartbeat. He saw, written in careful script, the words probability and assumption where there should have been certainty. Every line eroded a little more of the cold conviction he had wrapped around himself since the night of Ash. Still he delayed. To walk into that room would be to make his involvement personal, to look directly at the life he had almost ended. It would be to admit that the law he had forged as a shield might have become a blade he swung blindly. For a king who had taught himself that distance was safety, the thought felt like standing on the edge of a drop. He told himself there was no need. The healers were competent, the investigators thorough. His presence would add nothing but discomfort. Yet, every time he signed another order related to Elion's confinement, the ink seemed to darken strangely on the page, as if it carried more weight than it should. Eventually, the pressure of unasked questions and sleepless nights pushed him into motion. He chose a time when the council was not in session, when no one would trail behind him with a fresh list of crises. His cloak was plain by royal standards, the crown left behind on its stand. Even so, the two inner guards outside the room straightened as if a storm had just filled the corridor. They opened the door at his gesture and stepped aside. Kellen crossed the threshold alone. The space inside was smaller than he had imagined. The roof beams sloped low enough that he could have touched them if he raised his hand. A narrow bed took up most of the room, its thin blanket worn but clean. A table and stool shared the remaining corner. The high window let in a thin slice of afternoon light that painted a pale line across the floorboards. A lion sat on the edge of the bed, shoulders tense, arms wrapped around his middle as if his body itself were a shield. His prison tunic hung loose from the ribs but stretched tight over the rounded swell of his belly. At the sound of the door, he looked up, and for a moment his eyes did not register who stood there. Then recognition, or at least understanding of rank, flickered across his face, and his spine went rigid. Kellen felt the tension in the room like a physical thing, a cord strung taut between them. He was used to being surrounded by space, by courtiers and guards and the invisible cushion of his status. Here there was nothing between his skin and the gaze of the man whose death warrant he had signed. The next sensation hit him without warning. Scent. Over the years he had trained himself to ignore the sense of others as much as possible, especially of Omega's. In court they blurred into background notes under incense and polished wood, something his brain filtered out in favor of words and posture. But here, in this small room, there was nowhere for it to diffuse. It rose from Elion's skin with the warm, layered complexity of lived fear and stubborn endurance. There was the sharp tang of stress, the softer undercurrent of exhaustion, and beneath it all a distinct, familiar thread, that punched straight through Kellen's carefully built armor. His body recognized it before his mind did. Muscles tightened in his chest, his throat went dry. The hairs at the back of his neck lifted as if remembering fingers. No, he thought, and the denial snapped like old twine the instant he formed it. In the scraps of sleep he still managed some nights. A particular memory sometimes surfaced, despite his best efforts to bury it. A cramped room above a tavern on the lower streets. Heat pressed close between thin walls. An Omega who had not asked questions, who had listened without flinching when a man he knew only as a traveler had spilled, half drunk, words he never spoke within the palace. He remembered broad strokes, the curve of a shoulder under his hand, the hesitant strength in fingers that had traced the scar on his wrist, the quiet way the other had said, "You are carrying too much," without knowing the half of it. He remembered the scent most of all, that same blend of wary trust and reluctant tenderness. He had left before dawn with the taste of cheap wine and someone else's mouth still on his tongue, a coin on the windowsill, and a promise tossed over his shoulder like a scrap of cloth. This will not happen again. He had meant it as protection, for himself and for the faceless Omega whose bed he had borrowed for a few hours. The palace guards had found him not long after, dragging his other life back over his shoulders like armor. Now that night stood up from memory and sat before him in worn prison linen. The details had changed. Elion's face was sharper with hunger, his eyes lined by sleeplessness. The light in them was not the tentative softness of that long-ago evening, but a brittle wariness. Yet the line of his jaw, the shape of his mouth, the way his scent tightened when afraid and relaxed marginally with each small movement of the child inside him, were the same. Mosaic pieces, scattered for years, slid into place with an audible click inside Kellen's head. The condemned Omega whose case had cracked his law was the same man he had once used as a temporary refuge from that law. The child in his belly might be nothing to him. The child in his belly might be his. The realization punched through not only his guarded heart, but the entire structure of power he had built to keep that heart out of the equation. The decree of immediate execution, the cold efficiency of the scaffold, the refusal to consider exceptions, all of it had almost destroyed a man he had made vulnerable with his own hands, and a life that had never asked to be tied to his name. For a breath or two, he simply stood there, motionless, throat working around words that refused to form. Elion watched him, eyes dark and very clear. "You remember," the Omega said quietly. It was not quite a question, not quite an accusation, just a statement laid between them like a blade. Kellen swallowed. The room suddenly felt even smaller. "Yes," he managed. The single word tasted like ash and confession. Silence spread again, dense and full. In it, Kellen saw himself as Elion must see him now, not as a distant shape on a balcony, but as the man who had once come to him without a crown and then nearly killed him with one. He saw also, with a clarity that made his stomach twist, the brutal simplicity of his own laws. They had not distinguished between the guilty and the useful, between a calculated threat and a convenient body. Responsibility, the kind he had tried to smother under decrees and distance, stood up in front of him at last. It wore a prison tunic and a rounded belly and did not look away. "This," he thought, "is what I did. Not my advisors, not the faceless machine of the court. Me." He had imagined, after the night of ash, that abandoning mercy would protect him from ever feeling this exposed again. Now he saw that it had only delayed the moment when he would be forced to look straight at the cost of that choice. Between them, the child shifted under Elion's folded arms, a small movement almost invisible, but Kellen's gaze caught it, held it. The idea that this too might be his blood pressed against his ribs with almost unbearable force. He stopped. The word "killed" lodged too heavily in his mouth. "Yes," Elion said again, more sharply this time. "You nearly did." There was no rage in his voice, which somehow made it worse. Rage Kellen could have met with defenses built over years. This quiet, scraped-clean tone did not give him anything to push against. For a man who had grown used to commanding from heights, the realization that he could not step back from this, not without becoming smaller in his own eyes than any crown could afford, was terrifying. Yet beneath the fear was something else, the thin, insistent thread of a chance to choose differently. He took a slow breath, letting the Omega's scent and his own shame burned through his lungs. The law is mine, he thought. So is this mistake. So is what I do with it now. For the first time since his youth, the king allowed himself to sit, lowering himself onto the single stool in the room until his gaze was level with the man he had wronged. Outside, the fortress carried on with its routines, unaware that in one cramped chamber under its roof, the axis of its ruler's world had shifted by the simple, undeniable recognition of another person's scent. While the king struggled to absorb the weight of what he had uncovered, the court moved on the surface with the same polished grace as ever. The great hall still opened its doors to receptions, musicians still played in the gallery, courtiers still bowed and laughed and traded pleasantries under painted ceilings. Ambassadors still arrived with gifts and speeches, but behind closed doors, the air had changed. In the smaller chambers where real power lived, conversations grew sharper, stripped of the polite varnish they wore in public. Nobles who had grown comfortable with the predictability of Kellen's anger now watched with unease as a single act of mercy began to crack the entire edifice of punishment they had built their security on. The decree of immediate execution had not only kept enemies in check, it had also protected reputations. When a verdict was swift and final, there was no time for inconvenient questions. No one had to explain why a minor lord's troublesome bastard had disappeared into a noose, or why a rival merchant's clerk had been named in a conspiracy. The law, as they liked to say, was blind. Now the king's hesitation threatened to give it eyes. Some saw the danger very clearly. If Kellen admitted that the judgment in the Omega's case had been flawed, that he had nearly killed an innocent man and the child he carried, it would set a precedent that could not be easily contained. Other families might demand that their sons' and daughters' cases be reopened. Old accusations of falsified evidence, once whispered in corners, could be shouted with new confidence. Someone would have to answer for the shortcuts taken, for the reports conveniently edited, for the witnesses quietly pressured into saying the right words. And those someones sat in the very rooms now, filled with murmurs of concern for the stability of the kingdom. A circle of powerful figures began to press a different narrative. The pregnancy, they argued, was not a reason to spare the Omega, but the opposite. It made the situation more volatile. If word spread that being with child could delay or overturn a sentence, every condemned Omega would suddenly find themselves mysteriously expecting. Better, they said, to finish this one case quickly and quietly, to prevent an emotional precedent. If we falter now, one lord said in a private gathering lit by a single chandelier, the law will bleed. He meant it as metaphor. Others in the room heard it more literally. Law, to them, was something that fed on bodies. It stayed strong as long as there was blood to reinforce its authority. Gossip did the rest, seeping through the palace like water through hairline cracks. In a place where every idle comment could become a weapon, small indiscretions grew teeth. A guard, proud of having stood on the square that day, bragged in the barracks about seeing the king's hand shoot up in a way he had never seen before. He imitated Kellen's expression, the sudden tension, the way his gaze had fixed on the prisoner's belly. He looked, the man said, like someone had punched him. A healer's assistant, rattled by the sudden importance of his latest patient, let slip over wine that the sovereign had personally ordered close monitoring of the Omega's condition. "Do you know," he whispered, half impressed, half frightened, "how rarely he attaches his own name to such things?" Snatches of these remarks drifted into listening ears, were repeated, embroidered, and passed along. Servants talked in kitchens, scribes muttered in the archives, ladies-in-waiting leaned close over their needlework. A pattern emerged from fragments. The condemned Omega, they said, might be tied to the king by more than a legal order. No one had proof. They did not need it. In a court where alliances were forged and broken on rumors alone, the suggestion that the man under special guard was more than just a political problem was enough to shift the balance of conversations. Advisors intensified their pressure. Some wrapped their arguments in careful talk of continuity and order. They spoke of merchants reassured by firm rule, of border lords kept loyal by fear rather than love. They feared, or claimed to fear, what message it would send if the king allowed personal sentiment to bend the straight line of the law. Others were less subtle. You cannot let your heart make choices for the crown. one senior counselor said behind the closed doors of the strategy chamber. A ruler who hesitates because a prisoner carries a child, invites every enemy to use children as shields. They invoked the Knight of Ash as if it were a spell that could summon back the unyielding man they preferred. They reminded him how trust in an Omega had nearly poisoned his closest circle. They painted a lion not as a person caught in a tangle of injustice, but as another potential toxin. Mercy is what they exploit, they repeated. Mercy is how they reach you. Kellen listened in silence, jaw tight, fingers drumming once against the table before stilling. The old wound their words scraped had never fully healed. It throbbed now, trying to drown out the newer, fresher pain of seeing his own error so clearly in the flesh. But there was a fact inside the fortress that no argument could erase. A pregnant Omega whose execution had been stopped in front of the entire city. And a child who might or might not share the king's blood. That possibility went unspoken in most official rooms. To say it aloud without certainty would have been to unleash chaos, questions of succession, of legitimacy, of scandal. Yet its shadow lay over every meeting like a dark cloth. Those who suspected or guessed reacted in different ways. The ambitious imagined leverage. A secret heir, hidden away under guard, could be a tool in future negotiations. If they positioned themselves close to the matter now, they might profit later, no matter how it resolved. The fearful saw only danger. If the king acknowledged such a child, it would complicate established lines of inheritance and threaten carefully arranged marriages. If he did not, the mere whisper of his existence could be used by rivals to paint him a hypocrite. The most hardened, the ones who truly believed that the law was only as strong as its harshest edge, were simply angry. To them, Kellen was not a man wrestling with old ghosts. He was the embodiment of a system that had kept their enemies in check. That system, they felt, was now blinking. They wanted blood to seal the crack. A few of them met in even smaller circles, in rooms with no tapestries and only one door, after the official councils were done. The talk there was blunt, stripped of the caution they showed in the king's presence. They did not yet plan, but they wished aloud. It would be better, one said, if this inconvenience simply ended. An accident in the infirmary, a sudden complication with the pregnancy, a tragic miscarriage. There were ways, they all knew, to remove a piece from the board while maintaining the illusion that the rules had not been broken. They did not decide anything that night. They only let the thought exist between them like a shared secret. Outside the palace, the city felt the tension in smaller, less defined ways. Some citizens whispered that the king's heart might be softening, and for a breath they allowed themselves to dream that gallows might see fewer bodies. Others muttered that a ruler who hesitated was a ruler close to falling. Inside the fortress walls, Kellen walked a narrowing path between these expectations and his own conscience. Every step he took towards acknowledging the truth about Elion and the child risked breaking the image of the untouchable law his court demanded. Every step back from that truth required him to become the sort of king who could order the death of a man and a maybe child of his own to preserve a system he now knew to be flawed. The court, as always, did not care about the man. It cared about the shape of the power that held it together. To many of those who thrived in its halls, the law was valuable only as long as it drew blood on command. And now it watched, poised and hungry, to see whether its king would feed it again. When open attack became impossible, the palace shifted to other tactics. No one could openly oppose the king's decision to halt the hanging without risking the word treason being whispered in the wrong ear. The decree had been spoken in front of soldiers and citizens alike. It stood. But beneath that rigid surface, there were always those who believed that order could be restored by quieter hands, that a ruler's softness could be corrected without ever touching the crown. They did not look to the royal healers. The physicians who served the inner chambers of the fortress lived under constant scrutiny. Their ledgers were checked, their movements noted, their loyalties tested with every new appointment. To tamper with the king's will through them would have been reckless. Instead, the search for willing tools slid lower, into the kitchens and service corridors, into the ranks of people who owed their survival not to Kellen himself, but to the unforgiving system that had shaped them. For some of these men and women, a pregnant criminal, no matter how heavily guarded, was an affront to the order they trusted. If the law said such a person should hang, yet the rope had been stayed, then something was wrong. And when something was wrong, it fell, in their minds, to loyal servants to set it right. They spoke in hushed tones, late at night, over the steam of boiling pots and the hiss of roasting fat, about the danger of letting feelings contaminate justice. The solution that emerged was simple in design and cruel in intention. Food passed through many hands before it reached the guarded room under the roof. A ladle dipped into one pot rather than another, a sprinkle of spice over one bowl and not its twin, a vial emptied when no one was looking. No grand conspiracy was needed. Only one or two people who believed that they were protecting the kingdom from a precedent that could rot it from the inside. They chose a substance that did not kill swiftly. A bitter plant, powdered fine, known to mimic the signs of a body failing under strain. In small doses, it caused cramps, nausea, dizziness. In larger ones, taken by a pregnant body already weakened by prison, it could push the child into distress and drag the parent with it. To those who planned it, that was the neatest outcome. No visible rope, no public scandal. Only a regrettable complication blamed on nature. On the evening they acted, everything looked as it always did. The tray brought to Elian's door held a bowl of light soup, a wedge of bread, a jug of water beaded with condensation. The guard who took it from the kitchen carried it up without suspicion. He had done the same thing many times over the past weeks. To his nose it smelled of herbs and boiled meat. Elian had been fighting exhaustion all day. The pregnancy had grown heavier, his joints ached, and often his appetite sank beneath waves of nausea. That night, though, the child inside him lay unusually calm, and a hollow ache sat under his ribs. When the tray arrived, he found himself hungrier than he could remember being in weeks. He ate slowly at first, more from habit than caution, dipping bread into the broth, letting the warmth spread through the cold knot of his stomach. For a few brief minutes, the room felt almost ordinary. The distant sounds of the fortress softened to a muted hum. The window held a scrap of darkening sky. He could almost pretend, in that fragile pocket of quiet, that he was simply a tired man in a poor lodging, eating the only meal he could afford. The first wrong note came as a faint metallic taste at the back of his tongue. He frowned, swallowing, assuming the kitchen had been careless. Soup was soup. Prisoners did not complain. Then the world heaved sideways in a way that had nothing to do with spoiled stock. Dizziness washed over him, thick and sudden. His vision dulled at the edges, colors bleeding into one another. Nausea curled up from his gut, sharper than any morning sickness he had known, a twisting that made his muscles clench helplessly. Inside his womb, the child spasmed. What had been gentle turns became sharp, panicked jabs, as if the small body were trying to fight its way out of a space that had become hostile. "No," he whispered, one hand flying to his belly, fingers digging in. "Please, no." He tried to stand, intending to pound on the door to draw the guard's attention. His legs refused to obey. Pain lanced through his abdomen, hot and cold at once, and his knees buckled. The room tilted. The table edge scraped his hip as he fell, and then he was on the floor, cheek pressed against rough boards that seemed to roll under him like a ship's deck. The crash of the stool, the clatter of the bowl, reached the guard outside like a muffled thunder. He hesitated only a heartbeat before unlocking the door. The sight that greeted him drove all thoughts of ordinary clumsiness from his mind. The Omega lay curled on his side, one arm wrapped around his stomach, the other clawing weakly at the air. His skin shone with a thin sheen of sweat, his lips moved soundlessly. "Help," Elian managed, the word torn from him on a ragged breath. The guard shouted for others, his voice cracking with urgency. Within moments, boots pounded up the stairs. A second man knelt to check the prisoner's breathing, then ran for the healers without waiting for orders. The tray, half overturned, lay on its side, soup soaking into the floorboards, bread broken and uneaten. The healer who arrived first was the same one who had been monitoring Elian's progress for weeks. That familiarity made the change in his expression all the more alarming. He touched the Omega's forehead, felt the clammy heat, then pressed 2 fingers to his throat. The pulse hammered violently against his touch. "Lift him carefully," he snapped to the guards. "We need him on the bed, now." As they moved Elion, the healer's gaze flicked to the spilled food. He bent, dipped a fingertip into the small remaining pool, raised it to his nose. The sniff he took was brief, but his jaw tightened. "There is bitterness here that should not be," he said under his breath. He did not waste time on speculation. Orders flew from him, sharp and precise. Send for more supplies, cool cloths, certain herbs, secure the kitchen. No more food to the prisoner from any source until every pot and barrel had been examined. Word of a suspected poisoning traveled fast along certain channels. A messenger, breathless from running, found Kellen in the council chamber where yet another discussion of border tariffs and troop placements was dragging across the afternoon. The king had been only half listening, his thoughts still snagged on the image of a narrow room under the roof and the man who sat there. "The Omega," the messenger gasped, forgetting titles in his rush. "The one under special guard. He collapsed. The healer thinks it is poison." Something inside Kellen, held taut since the scaffold, snapped. For a heartbeat the room spun, overlaid by another older memory. A dining table, cups hitting stone, bodies slumping, the sweet, sick smell of tainted wine. The night of ash replayed itself in a new key. This time, the target was not his own blood already established in the world, but a life that might have been tied to him before birth. "Enough," he said, rising so quickly his chair scraped harshly against the floor. Whatever the counselors had been saying died in their throats. He did not stay to argue or listen to their protests about protocol. His feet carried him out of the chamber and down the corridors towards the inner infirmary with a speed that startled even his own guards. The fortress, sensing the shift in his mood, seemed to sharpen around him. In the small ward where healers worked, the air smelled of herbs, sweat, and fear. Elion lay on a narrow bed, face ashen, breaths coming too fast. Strips of damp cloth cooled his brow and neck. His hands still clutched his belly, fingers knotting every time a cramp tore through him. The healers moved in a controlled flurry, administering drafts, pressing points, listening for the rapid, stuttering rhythm of the child's heart, with instruments pressed against his skin. "The poison is fighting the body," one murmured, "his and the child's both." Every hour stretched long and thin. Outside the door, guards stood with faces carved from stone, knuckles white on their weapons. In the kitchens, supervisors tore apart pantries, tasted from pots, held jars up to the light. A few servants wept as they were questioned. Others stared back with dry eyes, secrets locked behind clenched jaws. An investigation began, but it had to run parallel to something more urgent: the attempt to hold 2 lives on the edge of a knife. The quiet effort to correct what some at court saw as the king's mistake had turned into another night in which he stood watching healers battle an invisible enemy inside a body he had nearly destroyed himself. Once again, Elion's fate and Kellen's collided at a point neither of them had chosen. This time, there was no balcony between them, no rope, no crowd. Only a narrow bed, a poisoned meal, and the knowledge that if the Omega died now, it would not be the law that had killed him, but the very hunger for law's blood that the king had unleashed years before. The poisoning did not remain a private catastrophe for long. Even before the healers had finished naming the symptoms, news slipped out of the infirmary and into the stone veins of the fortress. The notion that someone had dared attempt such a thing inside the king's own walls traveled from tongue to tongue, losing none of its sharpness on the way. To some, it was proof that Kellen's decision to spare the Omega had fractured more than his own reputation. If discontent had grown bold enough to pour bitterness into a guarded bowl, then the stability they had all relied on was already compromised. In the lower ranks of the army and among certain corners of the nobility, the same quiet phrase began to repeat itself: "The king is losing his edge." While they said it, the healers fought. The poison had jolted Elion's body into crisis. The strain hit a system already frayed by months of confinement, hunger, and fear. The child, carried almost to term, reacted like a drowning swimmer dragged under a sudden wave. Contractions began as spasms tangled with pain from the toxin. At first, the healers tried to separate one from the other, to calm what could be calmed and support what had to be allowed. Before long, it became clear that the body had chosen. Labor had been forced into motion. By nightfall, the fortress had taken on the peculiar tautness of a place under partial siege. Orders snapped down from the upper levels. All entrances to the inner chambers were to be secured. No one entered or left without being named and checked. Officers whose loyalty had already shown cracks were quietly reassigned to distant posts or given sudden leave. Patrol routes were altered. Extra guards appeared outside the infirmary, their spears crossed. In the city below, taverns hummed with rumors about poisoned traitors and soft kings. Inside the palace, the whispers shifted key. Some saw in the attack an alarming sign that factions were willing to kill even under the king's nose. Others muttered that the poison had only gone where the rope had been prevented from doing its rightful work. In a small, overheated chamber off the main ward, Elion moved through a night that felt like it would never end. The healers had chosen this room because it could be watched from all sides. The windows were narrow and high, the door thick, the space large enough for a bed and a cluster of people, but no more. Pain came in waves that drowned thought. It started as a deep, dragging ache in his lower back and abdomen, then surged into something sharper, a tightening squeeze that wrapped around his middle and refused to let go. Each contraction felt layered. His muscles fought not only to bring the child into the world, but against the residue of poison burning in his blood. Sweat slicked his skin despite the chill cloths pressed to his forehead. Voices moved around him, sometimes close, sometimes far away. Hands checked his pulse, his dilation, the position of the baby. Someone murmured encouragement. Someone else named times and measurements. "Breathe," a voice told him, calm and firm. "You must breathe for 2. He clung to that command like rope. Inhale, even when his lungs felt too small. Exhale, even when a groan tore loose with the air. Between contractions, the room seemed to tilt, shadows blurring, but the awareness that another life depended on him stayed like a line drawn through the chaos. Outside the door, Kellen stood as if his body had rooted to the spot. He could do nothing practical. He was no healer. His presence inside the room would only crowd it, but leaving felt impossible. Every shout, every muffled sound, seemed to pull directly on the same nerves that had burned during the night of ash, when he had watched 2 people he loved slip beyond the reach of any medicine. Now, the stakes were different and the same. The child being fought for in that room might never bear his name, at least not publicly, but in the privacy of his own mind, he could no longer pretend they had nothing to do with one another. Losing this baby would not just be a political disaster. It would cement in the cruelest possible way the story that his laws consumed even those bound to him by blood. He could feel the court pressing up against his back even as he faced the door. On one side, the rigid expectation that he prove himself as unbending as ever. On the other, the thin, new thread of something like hope that perhaps, just this once, the cycle of death he had set in motion could be broken. Behind him, corridors thrummed with movement. Messengers ran with notes to the barracks and the kitchens. Commanders received quiet instructions to watch certain units more closely than others. Those who supported the king's decision to investigate rather than kill pulled tighter around him. Those who had muttered about weakness now traded glances in alcoves, calculating what might be gained from a ruler whose attention was fixed on one room. In the lower barracks, someone used the word uprising in a whisper, more a thought spoken aloud than a plan. In the noble quarters, a lady with sharp eyes remarked that the kingdom seemed to be holding its breath for a child that might never be acknowledged. The notion that one Omega and his unborn could shake the spine of the law this much both fascinated and unsettled them. Inside the chamber, another contraction tore through Elion, this one so fierce it seemed to split him in 2. A cry ripped free of his throat, raw and unshaped, the sound of a body pushed beyond what it thought it could endure. "I cannot," he gasped, vision swimming. "You can," someone answered, close to his ear. "You already have to come this far." He did not know whose hand he crushed in his own. He only knew that when he bore down, following the instructions flung through the haze, something shifted deep inside. Pressure, stretching, burning, a sense of the world narrowing to the width of a single passage through which everything had to move. Time fractured. It could have been minutes or hours between that moment and the next. Then, all at once, the tension broke. A rush of warmth, a wet slide, and the heavy ringing silence of a held breath. For a heartbeat, the whole fortress seemed to wait. The child's first cry cut through that waiting like a blade. It was not a delicate sound. It was loud, outraged, a tiny, furious protest against light and cold and all the unknowns of the world it had been dragged into. It echoed off the stone walls of the chamber, slipped under the door, ran down the corridor to where guards and king and servants stood frozen. Kellen closed his eyes briefly. The noise slammed into his chest with the force of a blow. All the arguments, all the whispered doubts, all the carefully layered justifications for cruelty fell away in the face of that small, insistent declaration of existence. A healer emerged a short while later, sleeves stained, hair damp with sweat. He carried a bundle in his arms wrapped in clean linen, small face peeking out, scrunched and still red from the effort of arrival. Those in the corridor straightened, instinctively aware that they were not just witnessing a birth, but watching a symbol be carried past them. They saw more than an infant. They saw the living intersection of every tension coiling around the kingdom, law and mercy, control and vulnerability, secrecy and bloodline. Some felt a flicker of awe, others tasted the bitter tang of resentment on their tongues. A lion lay back on the bed, empty and unbearably full at the same time. His body shook with the aftermath of pain, muscles trembling, skin chilled despite the blankets piled over him. The absence inside him felt strange, a hollow that seemed to echo with each breath. And yet when they placed the child in his arms, the sense of loss vanished beneath a flood of something fierce and tender. The baby was small but solid, weight settling against his chest with surprising heaviness. Tiny fingers flexed, then curled into the fabric of his tunic. The cries softened to hiccups, then to restless little sounds as the infant rooted blindly for warmth and comfort. The world narrowed to the curve of that soft head under his chin, to the warm puff of breath against his skin. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Elion's fear of what might come next loosened its grip. The future was still a storm beyond the walls, full of kings and councils and dangerous men. Inside the circle of his arms, there was only this small life that had fought to reach him. Outside, the fortress continued to buzz with rumors and hurried steps. Plans were laid, loyalties weighed, the word rebellion shared in more than one room. Inside, one Omega, who had once been marked for the noose, stared down at his child and felt something unfamiliar take root. For once, he wanted to live, not because he was afraid to die, but because someone else needed him to stay. The birth and the poison marked a line that could not be stepped back over. Even in a fortress built of stone and habit, there came moments when the old ways no longer fit the shape of what had happened. Kellen felt that truth like a grit in his teeth every time he tried to swallow down doubt. He had almost hanged his own blood. When that failed, his own court had almost finished the work with a bowl of tainted soup. To pretend that the system was sound would have been a lie so large it might crack him open from the inside. The council was summoned in full. Nobles, generals, senior judges, church representatives, the old counselors who had been there since his father's reign. The chamber filled with rustling fabrics and guarded eyes. Outside, the city rustled with quieter movements, sensing that something was shifting above its head. The arguments began before all the chairs were taken. They were familiar words, worn smooth with repetition: order, discipline, the need to show no weakness. One lord with a heavy gold chain across his chest insisted that the entire affair with the Omega had already harmed the crown's authority. The only way to close it, he said, was to restore clarity, separate the child from the scandal, remove the parent, reinforce the law. Others, more careful, suggested compromise. Perhaps the baby could be kept raised away from the lower city, shielded from the past. The Omega, on the other hand, could be quietly exiled or sent to some distant monastery. No rope, but no precedent either. Kellen listened, hands still on the carved arms of his chair. He heard their fear, their self-interest, their genuine concern for the kingdom, all tangled together. He understood it. He had shared it once. Yet every time someone invoked stability, his mind threw up images that did not match the word. The night of ash, with its overturned goblets and cooling hands, the scaffold and the rope, the curve of Elion's exposed belly under gray sky. the cramped infirmary chamber, slick with blood and sweat, where a newborn's first cry had cut through the walls like a blade. In all of those scenes, Omegas had been present not just as threats, but as bodies that bled under the weight of decisions he had made. The law, he realized, had not been neutral. It had been shaped by his own fear, sharpened by his refusal to ever again feel as helpless as he had that first terrible night. And like any blade drawn too often, it had begun to swing of its own momentum. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than some had expected, but it carried through the hall. "The decree of immediate execution," he said, "has served its purpose and gone beyond it." There was a ripple then, not of sound, but of tension. He saw jaws clench, fingers tighten on chair arms, glances dart sideways. He did not let himself stop. "We will write a new law." It was not done in one sitting. Jurists were summoned, their ink-stained fingers trembling slightly as they realized what was being asked of them. Chroniclers were called to advise on how such a shift would sit in the long line of royal statutes. Priests weighed in on mercy, on the value of repentance, on the sin of spilling innocent blood under the banner of justice. Drafts were composed, read aloud, torn apart, written again. Every word would live in records and be used in arguments long after all of them were gone. It could not be vague. In its final form, the new decree changed the spine of the old system. The order for immediate execution in cases of conspiracy against the crown was revoked. In its place came a layered process, mandatory second and third reviews of evidence, independent questioning of witnesses, the right for the accused to have their circumstances considered rather than folded into a convenient group. No more could probability alone carry a neck to the noose. A separate clause stated that pregnant Omegas and parents of very young children could not be executed until a full investigation had been completed and alternative sentences considered. It did not promise safety. It did, however, forbid the machine from crushing lives without first looking at them. Another section addressed the matter everyone was careful not to name too plainly, the danger of cases like Elian's being buried. It allowed for past convictions under the old decree to be reopened if substantial doubt about evidence emerged. No one missed the way certain faces paled when that line was read. Elian's own case was given its own article. The conviction was declared erroneous. The word weighed heavy on the page, a formal acknowledgement that the crown could be wrong. The sentence was annulled. He was no longer a condemned man under special guard, but a free subject placed for his own protection and that of the child within the bounds of the fortress. It was not the freedom of open roads, but it was life without a rope over his head. As for the baby, the language tread a narrow path. The child was recognized as of the king's blood and granted a special status within the royal line. Not placed in direct succession, not yet, but wrapped in layers of protection that made it clear no other claimant could easily sweep them aside. Behind the cautious phrases lay a simple truth. Kellen had chosen to acknowledge on paper what his body had already told him in that cramped room. When the day came to announce the decree, the atmosphere in the great hall crackled. Heralds in formal livery stood ready, scrolls in hand. The court assembled in full, every jewel and polished boot in place, the surface of power arranged just so. Kellen did not let a proxy speak for him. He stepped forward himself, took the document from the herald, and read. His voice did not falter, though he could feel the weight of each line settling on shoulders around him. Some nobles accepted the words with stiff, contained displeasure. They bowed because the crown told them to, and because their own fortunes were tied too tightly to it to risk open defiance. Others, especially those who had watched too many relatives and retainers vanish into the gallows, felt something like cautious relief. In the military ranks, reactions were split. Officers who believed iron discipline was all that kept chaos at bay muttered about softness, about the dangerous message sent to enemies. Those who had stood on too many scaffolds, seeing fear in the eyes of people whose guilt had never been fully explained, held their tongues and listened harder. Beyond the walls, word spread more slowly, but with a different flavor. In the lower city, where the rope had always felt closer than the crown, the news was passed from mouth to mouth over cracked mugs and market stalls. A king who could stop his own law from devouring him, they said, might one day stop it from devouring them. It was not a revolution. No chains fell from wrists that day, no prisons emptied. But in a kingdom taught to believe that the law always moved in one direction, the idea that it could be halted, questioned, reshaped was a spark. In his private chambers that night, with the ink on the decree still drying in the official books, Kellen stood by a window and looked out over the dark roofs of his city. Behind him, in a quieter room, a lion slept with the child curled against his chest, both of them breathing in the slow, uneven rhythm of new life. The old noose still hung in the execution yard, coiled and waiting. The difference now was that it no longer tightened on the strength of fear alone. Between its knot and the necks it might one day claim, Kellen had finally placed something else, his own hand, and, for the first time in many years, a choice. Time dulled the sharpest edges of that day, but it never erased them. The scaffold on the square before the fortress still stood, its dark beams cutting a familiar shape against the sky. The rope was replaced when it frayed, the boards were repaired when they warped, yet the structure no longer felt like the unquestioned endpoint it once had been. It had become a reminder of a pivot. People passing by did not only whisper about those who had died there, they also spoke in half-hushed tones of the Omega who had already stood beneath the noose and then walked away alive. Children played at its foot when guards were distracted, daring one another to climb the first steps before being chased off. Vendors set up their stalls a little closer than before, as if the shadow of the scaffold no longer bit quite as hard. Stories, embroidered and altered with each retelling, threaded through the market. Of a king who had stopped his own order, of a baby whose first cry had been heard all the way to the city gates. No one knew the details, but the myth did not need them. Inside the fortress, life had shifted in ways that were less visible from the streets. Elion no longer slept in a cell, nor in the narrow room under the roof. The heavy lock and barred door were memories now. Instead, he'd been given a set of modest chambers in one of the inner wings, the sort reserved for visiting scholars or lesser dignitaries. The stone walls remained, but there were tapestries to soften them, a hearth that was lit on cold evenings, windows low enough for him to look out without craning his neck. The space was not luxury in the way courtiers understood it, but to someone who had lived with straw and iron, it felt almost excessive. He spent his days tracing the slow miracle of growth in the child who had been born from poison and fear. Tiny hands learned to grasp his finger, then the edge of a cup, then anything within reach. A small head lifted, wobbled, steadied. Eyes found the square of light on the floor and followed it, then turned to faces, to movements, to the bright flash of a toy. Routine arrived, built from small acts. Feedings, bathwater warmed over coals, walks along the quieter galleries with the baby bundled against his chest. There were nights when memories of rope and shouting still tore him from sleep, heart racing, breath tight. On those nights, the steady weight of the child, sprawled heavy and warm against him, anchored him back to the present. Kellen's presence in those rooms started as a formality. A king checking on the well-being of a royal ward, nothing more. His first visits were brief, standing at a careful distance while healers recited reports, and Elion watched in wary silence. When he was finally persuaded to hold the baby, his hands looked absurdly large, the fragile bundle stiff in his uncertain grip. "He will break," he muttered once, almost under his breath. "He will not," Elion answered, the words slipping out before he could dress them in politeness. The child did not break. He gurgled, grabbed a fold of the king's cloak, and refused to let go. Something in Kellen's face, usually so carefully composed, loosened at that small act of trust. From then on, he came more often, at first with excuses, to hear how the new decree was being received in the city through Elion's sharper ears, to ask about the lower streets, to test his own ideas against someone who had not been born to marble halls. Slowly, the excuses fell away. He learned how to support a drowsy head, how to sway just enough to soothe a fretful body, how to endure sticky fingers grabbing at his hair. The child, who knew nothing of titles or past sins, recognized in him not a crown, but a steady heartbeat in arms that with practice became less unsure. In those small domestic moments, a bond formed that no proclamation could have commanded into existence. The space between Kellen and Elion did not smooth itself into romance overnight. There were too many jagged pieces scattered between them. The memory of a night when one man had used the anonymity of the other as an escape hatch from his duties. The memory of a day when that same man had signed a paper that almost ended two lives. Guilt sat heavy in the room at times, unspoken but present. So did fear, and a stubborn, shared refusal to pretend that any of it had been clean. They began cautiously to talk about those things, not in long confessional speeches, but in fragments dropped into the spaces between tasks. A remark about the smell of tavern smoke, a quiet acknowledgement that a certain street had once been a route to a bed that was not supposed to matter. A rough admission from Kellen that he had been a coward in more ways than one. The language they trusted most remained the practical one, whose turn it was to rock the child when he cried at night, who noticed first that he liked the feel of rain on his hands, who understood the signs of a fever coming before it spiked. Outside their rooms, the court arranged and rearranged its narrative. For some, the sight of an Omega moving through the inner corridors with a child on his hip and a guard at his shoulder remained an offense. For others, it was a symbol of a kingdom shifting, however slowly, away from the idea that only one kind of person had the right to stand beside the throne. Gossip flared and faded. Alliances adjusted. The fortress, like any living thing, adapted. Within its walls, a new reality took shape. Elion found that his sensitivity to the moods around him, once treated as a flaw, had become a resource Kellen relied on. He noticed when a particular commander's deference rang hollow, when a petition from the lower city carried a desperation that would erupt if ignored too long. His understanding of fear and hunger informed discussions about patrol routes and grain stores. He was no longer just an object of control. He was a partner whose perspective could tilt decisions away from the bluntest edge of the law. There were setbacks. They argued. Old instincts flared, especially when danger loomed, and Kellen's first impulse was still to tighten his grip. Elion, who knew what that grip felt like from the other side, did not always concede. But over time, their conflicts shifted from being about survival to being about how to live with what they had already survived. In the evenings, when the fortress sank into its peculiar, echoing quiet and the child slept, sprawled sideways across the bed with the careless peace of the very young, Elion sometimes stepped out onto the narrow balcony of his chambers. From there he could see the square and, in its corner, the scaffold. Distance blurred the details, but he remembered them too clearly to need sight. The roughness of the wood under his bare feet, the weight of the air when the crowd had fallen silent, the scratch of hemp against his neck. He also remembered the moment when that line of his life had bent, impossibly, away from the drop. A raised hand on a balcony he could barely see, a command that had cut through the machinery of the law like a knife, a choice that had cost the king more than anyone below had understood. That was where this unlikely family had begun, at the point where a man built on fear had for once chosen to stop his own fear from doing its worst. If you have listened to this story to the end, remind yourself that even the harshest order can sometimes be halted if someone dares to admit they were wrong. That even the one already standing under the rope can become the person who forces a kingdom to change its rules. Write in the comments whose transformation in this story felt strongest to you. Elion, who walked the path from condemned man to father, Kellen, who risked breaking his own law, or those who, despite their fear, chose to stand behind the new decree. Do not forget to support the channel with a like and a subscription so you do not miss the next Forbidden BL story about how even at the scaffold, a new, honest life can begin.